Good afternoon. Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this session on distribution connection pricing and processes. We'll just start with a karakia. Mori oho, mori tū, mori ora, kia tātou, homie, huie, taikie. I'm Tim Sparks, Director Network Pricing at the Authority, and I have with me Catherine Hume-Pike, Principal Advisor. I have Ross Parry from Consultation and Brianna Yee from the Authority as well. We're also lucky enough to have Simon Wakefield with us from the Commerce Commission. Simon's a Principal Advisor in the Price Quality Regulation team at the Commission. He's been involved in looking at the interaction between the Authority's proposals and the Commission's role in setting price quality parts and the information disclosure requirements. Thanks for joining us, Simon.
Nice to be here, thank you.
So I might just go through the agenda if we could have that. So first we are going to tackle network connection processes with Alan Davison. And I should introduce Alan as well. He's not in the room with us, but he is a principal analyst in the Retail and Networks Policy team at the Authority, and he'll be leading on network connection processes. And then we'll have Catherine talking about distribution connection pricing, and we'll just finish up with next steps. So before we get into the proposals, I'll just say a few words about why the Authority is doing this and where we think this is heading. So the purpose of today's session is to provide an overview of two consultation papers that we've recently released. We're very keen to receive feedback so the Authority can make informed decisions in the first half of next year, taking all the various views into account. Both consultations aim to make connecting to distribution networks more efficient. And that's in terms of a business, an investor, housing developer, industrial consumer, or other energy user paying upfront costs to connect, and the ongoing costs associated with that connection, and also the application process to connect. So currently the rules around connection pricing methodologies are very light touch, which is out of step with what's happening in other jurisdictions like Australia and the UK. It's also allowed some issues to crop up that are creating barriers to getting some energy users connected. Issues like high upfront costs that can deter developments from happening or place extra costs on connecting businesses and their consumers. Another one is the problem of first mover disadvantage. This is where a business or another energy user connecting to the network triggers a network extension or an upgrade and faces higher connection costs than those who follow. You can see how this is a problem and how it might not create good outcomes for the economy or for consumers. Our focus is on ensuring the regulatory settings promote reliability, competition and efficiency for the long-term benefit of consumers. A separate issue is that application processes for connecting can vary greatly between distributors. This can add unnecessary cost and complexity for those wanting to connect to networks across multiple regions. For example, an EV charge point operator. One problem we've heard about is around more speculative applications that can take up distributors' time and resources away from firmer, more ready-to-go applications, clogging up the queue and creating delays. The rules around connection processes haven't been substantively updated for 10 years. Given New Zealand's push to electrify the economy, we think the time is right to ensure the rules are fit for purpose. We think getting the right rules in place is good for New Zealand businesses and getting more important infrastructure in place, including more electricity generation. Importantly, it's also good for consumers in the long run. The proposals in both papers represent the first phase of anticipated change. If we're to truly make application processes and pricing methodologies more efficient, further changes will also be needed. I hope today's session is helpful in understanding the proposals and the Authority's vision where we want to go. I'll finish up by saying we are keen to get your feedback on the two sets of proposals through our submission process. Both consultation papers include fairly comprehensive draft code, and we'd like to get your thoughts on that as well. I'll talk through the next steps towards the end of this session. And following that, we'll have some time to answer some questions. Please remember you can put your questions in the chat at any time. We have limited time, so this is not the right time to make statements or verbal submissions. There is space in the submission forms to capture your views, so we really want to use the Q&A part more to help provide clarity to help people with their submissions. Later this week, we'll email around a written record of all the Q&As and make that available on the Authority website. We're also recording this session and we'll publish the video on our website. And with that, I will hand over to Alan Davison, Principal Analyst, who will talk through the Stage 1 proposals of the Network Connections project.
Thanks, Tim. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm Alan Davison. Network connection processes is a work that's been going on for a few years now. We've released a couple of consultation papers over the last couple of years, and conversations with the sector with a wide range of stakeholders has raised a whole raft of issues, and that's the origin for this work. Next slide, please. So there's two stages. Well, at the moment, there's two stages to the Network Connections project. Stage 1 is very much, and this is the consultation paper that's currently out. That's all about Stage 1. That's all about connecting and also upgrading connections as well. You know, strong story come through from stakeholders that particularly decarbonising industrials and commercials, you know, ports, those sorts of places. Getting greater capacity for electricity can be quite a challenge, and so this is why we focused on this stuff. Stage 1, people have told us this is their biggest challenge, but there's a lot to do in this space, and so we've decided to break the work down. So Stage 1 is very much about the connection process and upgrading connections. Stage 2 is a bit of a catch-all for everything else. We haven't pinned down the scope entirely, but there's a whole raft of things that we are looking to address, from connection and operation standards to unauthorized connections, congestion and curtailment, small DG processes, which we've parked for now, embedded networks, and more work on fees. We've done some preliminary or intermediate work on fees, which you've probably seen, and we want to address these more fully in Stage 2. Next slide, please. So it's very much about Part 6, this work. Part 6 hasn't seen a lot of love. It's not really changed since 2007, not in any massive way. If we think to what the world's like today, 60,000 solar connections, solar farms, all that sort of stuff, wind. It's a very different world. Connections or applications to connect are larger and they're more complex, and they're much larger in number too. And Part 6 hasn't really responded to that. And so this is where we focused our efforts. And pretty much everything we've proposed, apart from a few Part 1 definitions, will all go in and propose new Part 6. Next slide, please. So this is a brief summary of some of the challenges. This won't come as a surprise to anyone, but network capacity is a bit opaque to a lot of people. And we see the sector is changing. We see some EDBs are accessing smart meter data and using very, specialized IT algorithms to get a greater understanding of what's going on in their networks. And that's great. We'd like to see more of that. But at the moment, outside the EDBs themselves and even their EDBs, there's not a great deal of visibility of how much capacity is available for people seeking to connect. And also, it's not really obvious how many people are sitting on a network waiting to connect. And one of the things we've sort of looked at is what Transpower does in this area. And they have a grid connections framework. So that's one of the things we've proposed. Wide variation in processes, as Tim mentioned, quite frustrating for the people that operate, particularly across the country. We hear that some EDBs are not so well set up to engage with access seekers, and that can sometimes be a frustrating process. The application processes itself, in Part 6, not really comprehensive enough to respond to what actually occurs in that application process on the ground. And so this is why we've proposed a number of changes to that. Some of the provisions are very weak, prioritization, for example. And some of the approval times can be slow, and there can be all sorts of reasons for that. And that may not be anything to do with the EDB. And of course, getting infrastructure installed can sometimes take time as well. Next slide, please. So these are the proposals, 4 major ones. We have proposed quite a few changes for larger capacity DG applications, 10 kilowatts and above. We haven't looked at 10 kilowatts and below yet, but we will. Includes all sorts of stuff from finite time frames to approve, adding an intermediate stage for very large DG applications, reflecting the complexity of those application processes in practice. And we've got very good feedback on that to date. Adding an upfront fee, for example, to stop tire kickers, and a few other proposals as well, which we think will help to improve the efficiency of the application process and speed the application process up from beginning to end. We've proposed to add load application processes to the Part 6, something that's never been in there previously. I've talked to some barriers. Those barriers would apply, the ones I've spoken to previously, both load and DG. So it can be quite challenging to do that too. And if we want consistent processes and we want efficient processes, then prescribing those in the code should help us get that. Network connections pipeline. This is to provide a bit more efficiency in terms of where investment decisions are made. If you can know on a network how many people are waiting to connect, and if you could know to some degree where the capacity is available, we think those two proposals should help to channel applications to where there's the greater chance of faster connections. And so those two work in concert. And, this is something that certainly in terms of network connections, pipework, Transpower has been doing for a while. And I think the authority is very much of the view, I think most people would be, that we need greater visibility of network capacity to be more efficient. And so that's a journey we want to see everybody take. We want to see the sector moving towards a greater understanding of where capacity is and what's occurring on low voltage networks. A few other proposals, updating the regulated terms. These are the terms that apply if you don't sign a connection contract. So a few changes there, for example, in terms of metering requirements. We're currently proposing regulated and prescribed terms for load applications. We have to take a slightly different view on load because load applicants are typically not participants under the code. So we'll include some options there. We've also talked about the potential to use different approaches for the operational terms for load applicants, and that's spoken to in the paper. Record keeping requirements for distributors. Part 6 has got some requirements in terms of record keeping for EDVs, and we've suggested that those become a little more comprehensive. I think great scrutiny of that data in terms of how many applications, how long have they taken to progress, how many have fallen by the wayside, how many sought extensions, will be very useful data for understanding how the sector is going. We see that very much as a sort of sector metric, as opposed to just being an EDB metric. Some Part 1 definitions, which we have aligned with the review of Part 8 of the code in terms of some of those definitions we've proposed. So they should all line up with our FSR work and some minor technical amendments. Next slide, please. So we think there's a whole raft of benefits from these proposals. That includes greater efficiency of distribution networks, so more consistent and improved distributed practices, better use of network capacity, deferred and avoided investment in new capacity, increasing the rate of renewable energy uptake. You think some of the more speculative applications will be less prioritised in the new process, and stuff that's ready to connect can move through the queue quicker. Decarbonisation, we would like to think the proposals will allow people to upgrade their connections and switch from fossil fuels like coal boilers more quickly. Greater investment through a greater understanding of what's happening on networks, both in terms of capacity and applications waiting to connect. And I think through the removal of new connections, barriers to new connections and upgrades to existing connections, we should help to improve industry productivity. I think if you look at the proposals in the paper in their entirety, they do put some onus on distributors, to be fair, but not solely. And certainly in the earlier part of the application process, it does. But we think there's benefits in the proposals for EDBs. And as you move through the process, we see, as you move through to like a queuing and management approach that we've proposed for part 6, where the EDB would develop, or EDBs would develop queuing and management policies to ensure that proposals keep moving from beginning to end, certainly past final approval. The onus passes more on to the applicants, the access seekers. But we hope that the proposed changes should lead to great efficiency overall of the sector, and getting more DG connected and getting more load connected and getting it connected more efficiently, quicker, easier, more equitable in terms of ensuring that stuff that should be connected is connected, and more consistent across the country. That's me.
Thanks, Alan. I think we'll hand over to Catherine to talk us through distribution connection pricing.
Thank you, Alan. I'm Catherine Hume. I work at the Authority on distribution connection pricing. Alongside the work that Alan's overviewed, we're also consulting on introducing pricing methodologies into the Electricity Participation Code. I really appreciate that so many of you have made the time to join us in today's session. This consultation paper follows on from our earlier consultation paper in July of 2023 and the Next Steps paper published in May of this year. Our intention today is to provide a relatively high-level overview of the current consultation, especially for those less familiar with the topic. We're really interested to hear from distributors and also those seeking access to distribution networks. In the next few slides, I'll outline the problem we've identified and the package of proposed fast-track measures. I'll also touch on full reform, which we may consider in the future. One thing to note is where the scope of the work on connection processes includes load and distributed generation, the scope of this consultation on pricing is load only. The costs of establishing and maintaining distribution networks are recovered through both upfront charges and ongoing lines charges. Network users typically pay a lump sum upfront to the distributor to connect to the network, and then pay ongoing lines charges to electricity distributors through their energy retailer. Distributors' costs not recovered via upfront charges are recovered through ongoing lines charges. This work is focused on pricing methodologies for the one-off upfront charges that are triggered when a customer requests a new connection or enlarged connection to the distribution network. Connection pricing is a fundamental component of access to networks. We have observed and users have raised concerns about inconsistent practices across the distribution sector, adding inefficient cost and complexity for connection applicants. To date, regulation has not provided strong or consistent incentives for efficient pricing. Connection charges that are poorly structured can cause coordination challenges, such as first mover disadvantage and piecemeal network development. The authority is concerned particularly that inefficient pricing will deter efficient investment and slow down electrification and add unnecessary costs that can flow through to consumers. We've also been told that it's difficult for some parties to resolve disputes around connections. We observe there has been a steady trend over the last decade of an increasing reliance on upfront charges to fund expenditure relating to connecting customers to the network and system growth. The graph here looks at two categories of capital expenditure that are relevant to connection pricing methodologies: connection CapEx and system growth CapEx. The proportion of network investment which is funded by access seekers, parties connecting to the network, and how this has changed in recent years is clearly evident. The upfront costs charged are referred to as capital contributions. The historical and forecast data is disclosed each year by the 29 electricity distribution businesses. The top blue line is the proportion of connection CapEx that is funded by the connecting party. The bottom purple line is the proportion of system growth capital expenditure that is funded by the connecting party. The red line is a combination of the two. The analysis shows the trend for the connecting parties to pay a higher proportion of the cost for infrastructure to connect to the network and the infrastructure to support network growth. This total has increased from around 1/5 to 1/2 over the past decade. This is consistent with incentives and pressures faced by some distributors. It's also concerning when electrification of the New Zealand economy depends on affordable network access. This graph is for the whole industry. There's a range of outcomes for distributors, and the results are impacted by some distributors who have significantly increased their upfront charges in recent years. Some distributors are also planning further increases. We are concerned about high upfront charges. If charges are too high, this can inefficiently suppress demand for new and enlarged connections. We're also concerned about low connection charges, as these can indicate that distributors are not sending cost-reflective price signals to access seekers to guide their investment decisions. If upfront charges are set very low, existing consumers may be subsidising connection growth. Where connection charges are very low, the cost of providing a connection is met by the distributor and flows through to a higher regulated asset base, and the costs are met by other consumers. The regulatory framework needs to support an efficient access regime while being flexible so good practice can evolve and be adopted by others. Through our policy development phase, we looked particularly at the UK and Australian regimes as reference points. Both these regimes face similar issues and have implemented quite different regulatory approaches to address them. Our preference is to draw inspiration from these regimes and the existing practices of New Zealand distributors. We want to develop a package tailored specifically to our context here in Aotearoa. These proposals, these fast-track proposals, aim to support more efficient investment in infrastructure by distributors and access seekers, which lowers overall cost to consumers and supports a growing, thriving and electrified New Zealand. Let's take a look at each of these proposals. Firstly, the connection enhancement cost requirement. Connection pricing methodologies in the UK and Australia both incorporate requirements for distributors to design and provide a cost for the most economic connection option. In Australia, it's called the least cost technically acceptable solution, which is a bit of a mouthful, and in the UK, the minimum scheme. They also require the cost of any enhancement to the least cost solution to be funded by the party who is driving it. Examples of customer-selected enhancements may be a request for undergrounding, a specific pole location that ensures their amenity, or provision of redundant capacity. Distributed-driven enhancements may be reconfiguring the network to accommodate future expansion or bundling in associated works. Ensuring the cost of the enhancement is met by the party who benefits will prompt efficient investment decisions with a flow on to the enhancements that are built. Ensuring flexibility is a key strategic priority for the authority. This is because it will lead to better outcomes for consumers in the long term. To future-proof this enhancement cost requirement, we are proposing to distinguish between the minimum scheme and a minimum flexible scheme. A flexible scheme is an alternative design that builds in some form of flexibility that meets the customers' and distributors' requirements at a lower cost. It may be the use of load control or reduced security or firmness in return for a lower cost. A key element of connection charges is the depth of cost recovery. This is the extent that a connecting party needs to pay for the cost of the current or future impact on the shared network assets upstream of their connection. The UK regime has recently moved to shallow charges, and Australia requires distributors to charge for costs using published rates that are approved by the regulator. In New Zealand, some distributors don't charge for upstream impact, some charge using a project-based approach, and some use rates per unit of capacity. Under a project-based approach, there are position and queue issues. For example, 5 people may connect to the network over time, and eventually all the available upstream capacity is used up. When the 6th person comes to connect, there's no more capacity, and they are asked to fund or contribute to the upgrade of a significant network asset. We propose that if a distributor allocates network capacity costs to a connecting party, it must be done using published rates, not by charging for network upgrade projects. If published rates are used, the rates must reflect the average cost of adding capacity at each network tier. This would mean that where a distributor charges for upstream investment, all connection applicants are charged on a consistent basis for consumption of network capacity. We consider this as preferable to the project-based approach, where costs are only allocated to an applicant who triggers a capacity upgrade. The network capacity costing approach removes the position and queue lottery that can deter efficient connection investment. This proposal does not require networks to charge connecting parties for upstream investments. However, if they do charge, then it must be on this basis. The proposal includes some features so distributors can tailor the application of this methodology to their individual circumstances. These features include a distributor able to have different rates across different parts of the network, the provision for distributors to have 0 rates, where there is no foreseeable need to increase capacity within their network planning horizon. Distributors can also nominate capacity limits for the upper network tiers so that really large projects trigger a threshold. We've also proposed to use actual costs where an upgrade is more expensive than the published rates by 1.5 times. The Pioneer Scheme pricing methodology. The Electricity Network Aotearoa publishes a summary of information on their members' connection charge pricing methodologies. This indicates 17 of 29 members currently operate some form of Pioneer Scheme, often referred to as a rebate or reassignment scheme. A Pioneer Scheme helps mitigate first mover disadvantage, which is the high cost that a first connection applicant faces if their connection requires a costly network extension that could be later accessed by other connection applicants. If the first mover or pioneer faces a much higher charge than later connection applicants, this can encourage them to delay their application until another party has funded the extension. This situation is an example of an applicant's position in queue determining their connection charges and leads to coordination challenges that distort the timing or suppress the number of connections to a network. Pioneer schemes are particularly relevant for networks that serve rural areas. In these areas, a new connection can require a network extension that, even when built to the minimum practical capacity, can accommodate additional connections in the future. We propose requiring all distributors to have a Pioneer scheme policy in place and published by 1 April 2026. The Pioneer scheme policy is a template that will be the basis for each Pioneer scheme on the network. Each eligible network extension will have its own scheme. We're proposing some parameters to ensure that there's a balance between the operating costs of administering this scheme and the benefits for access seekers, and these are outlined in the paper. Connection charge reconciliation pricing methodology. I'm going to try and step through this carefully because it's really important that people get a bit of a sense of what we're trying to set out here. We propose requiring distributors to prepare a reconciliation that shows the incremental cost and incremental revenue and network cost components of a quoted connection charge if requested by a connection applicant. The reconciliation will need to be based on a standard methodology to assess the incremental cost and incremental revenue. We are also proposing that this information is made available to the authority on request on an aggregate basis. The net incremental cost is the incremental cost of a connection less the present value of the incremental revenue that the connection will generate over its lifetime. If we look at the first part of our formula, the first three terms, if the connection charge is equal to the net incremental cost, then the new connection covers its costs over time. It's an important point conceptually, as if a distributor charges a connecting party the net incremental cost to connect, existing customers are made no worse off by the connecting party joining the network. We refer to this as the neutral point. Conversely, if a distributor is charging less than the neutral point, other customers are subsidising the connection and it is inefficient. The neutral point is the lower bound of the subsidy-free range. We are not suggesting that the connection charges should be set at the neutral point. This proposal is for a reconciliation requirement. We discuss a potential balanced point in Chapter 7 in the consult paper. A balanced point is where a new connecting party makes a contribution to network costs similar to what existing customers are making. In the reconciliation, network cost is the balancing item representing an amount an applicant is charged beyond or below the neutral charge. Conceptually, the network contribution to network costs conceptually, NC, the contribution to network costs, represents the applicant's contribution to costs that are unaltered by their connection. The standardised methodology for assessing the incremental costs builds on other elements of the package of fast-track measures. For example, the incremental cost includes the estimated cost of the network extension. It also includes includes the cost of network capacity, calculated consistent with the network capacity costing methodology. The proposal also specifies parameters for assessing incremental revenue. These include a connection revenue life of 30 years and for a residential connection, and 15 years for other connections, and a formula approach to reduce revenue to adjust for incremental OPEX. The calculations involved in cost reconciliation are an essential step in setting charges with reference to the neutral and balance points. The fast track measures do not go as far as requiring charges to be set in this way, but will provide some significant benefits. We think the benefits could include a clear conceptual framework that could increase consistency around key concepts across the sector and potentially influence how some distributors set connection charges, leading to fewer charges that are inefficiently low or high. We also see this methodology as an important stepping stone towards full reform. We expect the fast-track pricing methodologies proposed will improve connection pricing efficiency. However, the fast-track measures so far do not prevent distributors from increasing connection charges. We expect the drivers that contributed to the trend of increasing connection charges will continue in the foreseeable future. We therefore want to mitigate the risk that distributors inefficiently increase connection charges. To safeguard against further increase where connection charges are already high, we are proposing a reliance limit methodology. For the 2024 disclosure year, across the sector, 48% of growth CapEx was funded by capital contributions. We refer to the proportion of growth CapEx for funding by capital contributions as the reliance level. The reliance level is the extent to which distributors are relying on connecting parties to fund capital expenditure relating to growth on their networks. The reliance figure peaked at 50% in the 2022 disclosures and averaged 47% across the past 4 years. Given this trend, we propose two thresholds. The individual thresholds for distributors whose reliance in 2024 was above 47% get their own specific threshold. They must ensure their connection pricing methodologies are unlikely to result in reliance exceeding their 2004 level in a typical year. All other distributors get the sector threshold, and they must ensure their connection pricing methodologies are unlikely to result in reliance exceeding 47% in a typical year. We consider 47% as an appropriate level for the sector-wide cap, given it's consistent with the most recent plateau. For distributors whose reliance already exceeds the sector-wide cap, we propose these individual caps based on their 2024 level. This recognises distributors who have built up a position of high reliance may have limited ability to reduce their reliance in the near term. Dispute resolution. We need to ensure parties can resolve disputes about connection charges and the application of the proposed pricing methodologies. The authority is proposing to apply the dispute resolution process in Schedule 6.3 of the Code that currently applies to distributed generation connection requirements in Part 6. Ideally, the same dispute resolution could apply to both participants and non-participants. So we are considering if there is merit in an additional approach where pricing methodologies are reframed as default contractual terms rather than code requirements. This also has some advantages, including allowing parties to agree to private dispute resolution processes, which may be more flexible and faster than a regulatory model. We're really interested in your feedback on this alternative approach as well. I'm on my last slide because I want to make sure I've skipped a couple of paragraphs to make sure we've got time for questions. Facilitating the exemption process. The proposed capital contribution reliance limits methodology may prevent some distributors from proceeding with increasing the proportion of capital expenditure that is funded by upfront charges. For non-exempt EDBs, the DPP will reset based on forecasts made prior to the proposal to introduce pricing methodologies for connection pricing. The statutory framework provides for a situation where the authority makes a change to the code and it's relevant to price quality paths. The authority can use section 54V to ask the Commission to reconsider a price quality path. This may lead to the Commission adjusting the revenue allowance for an EDB. Distributors have the option of applying for an exemption from compliance with the code under section 11 of the Act. The exemption process provides the opportunity for price-regulated distributors to work through the adequacy of their revenue allowances with the Commission. The authority has considered the risk that changes to capital contributions could increase the financeability challenges distributors have highlighted. In its recent draft default price path decision, the Commission outlined its approach to financeability, which involves undertaking a notional financeability sense check. We recognise this is a significant interaction between the connection pricing methodologies and the Commerce Commission Part 4 regime. We expect these matters can be worked through and resolved as the legislation anticipates under 54V of the Commerce Act. Next one. As we've worked through the problem and potential solutions, we saw the opportunity for a phased approach. We consider the fast-track measures would provide some immediate improvement whilst laying a solid foundation for a full reform. The focus of this consultation is on the proposed fast-track measures. We're consulting on these now and could amend the code in the first half of next year, after allowing some time for businesses to amend their processes and align with the new requirements. The methodologies could be reflected in quotes from 1 April 2026. The extension window, highlighted in the picture, highlights that there is the provision to apply for an exemption from complying with a code requirement. The consultation paper provides an overview of anticipated features of full reform. The pricing methodologies for connections need to be cost-reflective, predictable and flexible to accommodate contestability where that's appropriate. We are not proposing code amendments on full reform at this stage. However, we thought it was useful to share our thinking on what full reform could look like as it provides context for the proposed fast-track measures. We are very interested in your views on the anticipated features of full reform and the timing options. I think I'll leave it there for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So we are keen to get your submissions. Submissions on both of these papers close on the 6th of December. We will be running a cross-submissions process immediately following that, so we'll get those submissions on the website as soon as we can. Details on how to submit in the slide there. Just reiterate that there are some draft code provided with the papers, and we're keen to get your feedback on the draft code as well as on the policy proposals. So I think with that, we'll perhaps move to questions.
Thank you. I'm just going to read some of the questions that you have been sending through for our panel to discuss and answer. So I'll start with the questions that pertain to Alan's presentation. So JK, thank you for your question. I'll direct this towards you, Alan, with any follow-up from Tim. Does the proposed process now create an obligation on networks to connect a customer? And if so, is that the intent of the authority?
Thanks for that. So Part 6 for DG has always always required an EDB to approve applications that are consistent with Part 6 and that meet the connection requirements put in place by the EDB. And we sought a legal opinion on whether or not that places a legal obligation on EDBs to connect those parties. And we've received the feedback that it does. And extending Part 6 to load applications would apply a similar obligation on EDBs to connect load applicants.
I'm just adding to that, we're obviously keen to hear your views on that proposal. So if you have any views, please set them out in your submission, and more clearly the better.
Thank you. Next question is from Callum. With reference to Alan's talk, how important is the decarbonisation benefit to the authority's rationale? I'm going to direct this towards you, Tim. Or Alan.
Look, I think the decarbonisation is important context, of course. When the authority is looking to promote an efficient electricity system, which is vital for a competitive growing economy, environmental sustainability and social wellbeing. We think New Zealand should have abundant and affordable energy at internationally competitive prices. And we are, of course, looking to promote our main statutory objective around competition, reliability and efficiency for the long-term benefit of consumers.
Thank you, Tim. The next question is from Josh. Thank you, Josh. Relating to connections processes. Alan, could you please walk through an example of a proposed large capacity load connection process, and would you consider minimum service level agreements?
Not sure I understand that question. I might need a bit more context.
I don't have additional context for you, Alan, but we...
Okay.
Maybe we can
come back to that
perhaps take that one offline, Ellen, might be the best way to go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
I'm going to go to a question from Trent. What obligations will we put on distributors to supply options analysis to connecting parties so they can make better decisions? There are a great deal of considerations for connections, and not all customers will understand the options. So I'm going to direct that towards Alan as well as Catherine.
I think that's a great question. I think one of the things to bear in mind with the code proposals is the code sets the basic framework, but ultimately there'll need to be another more detailed level below that, layer below that, where EDBs and access seekers will need to develop policy and processes detail, more informed, more detailed, more granular. And the paper talks to the network connections, streamlining connections program, the work that we're doing with the EEA and the ENA. And it's fair to say that that's something that could be addressed in the work that the ENA is looking at doing in terms of best practice policies. So the intention of that streamlining connections program is that we do the code, we set the basic framework. The ENA does the detailed policies and processes co-developed with stakeholders so that they meet the needs of stakeholders. And the EEA does the technical stuff. And this is a similar model used in Australia and in the UK, and that's where we're proposing to go. So that does mean that a lot of the detail that's not in the code will need to be developed by industry and applied by industry. So because the code in itself is a really slow moving, difficult to change, it can only ever be so big. It's already over 1,000 pages. It's just, and it's, you know, it just takes time to do stuff with it. So we're proposing that if that stuff goes into industry guidelines, it can be kept more up to date and can be amended more quickly. So that's where we've got to on there.
Yeah, I'd probably add one thing. This is quite close to our connection enhancement cost requiry. Just because we're requiring you to provide the cost for the minimum scheme doesn't mean that you can't provide costs and to have discussions with connecting parties about logical options. There's also the provision in our proposed code which allows parties to agree to share the cost of enhancements where they benefit both parties. So we're really encouraging that dialogue, but we just think it's important to have a bottom line that you provide the access seeker with the cost of the lowest cost option.
Thank you. We have a question from Richard, which I'll direct at Ross as well as Catherine. Does the introduction of a pricing methodology that is based on incremental revenue mean distributors, and by extension their owners and customers, are exposed to risk of commercial failure, and therefore the loss of this incremental revenue and of large load connection customers?
Yep, sure. So a couple of things on there. So for very large customers, so the incremental revenue piece for most customers will be based on a posted tariff. So most customers are in that kind of world. So there's a posted tariff, and that's used to consider the incremental revenue. For commercial customers, the assumption is that the revenue life of the connection is only 15 years, which is probably shorter than most commercial connections. So that's partly a risk mitigation. The other end is for very large customers, they tend not to have a posted tariff. They'll have a special pricing tariff, which actually leaves it free for between the distributor and the connection party, even with these rules in place, to decide how they're allocating the cost between upfront and ongoing. So I'd say no.
Thank you, Ross. We have another question from JK. They note that networks invest ahead of need. So the question is, what have you done around a future-looking view, around an appropriate reliance level, rather than a point view at a specific time? So direct that towards Ross and Catherine as well. So this is type of process.
Yeah.
Do you want to consider that one?
I might just jump in. I guess on the reliance limits, access seekers have told us that high connection charges are deterring investment, and the reliance limits reflect that ratio of connection charges and cost of investment. Our independent expert report has agreed that distributors should not seek to recover all of their connections plus system growth CapEx through capital contributions. And recovering this CapEx through connection charges would result in an inappropriate cross-subsidy from new customers to existing customers. That said, we are aware that our proposal on reliance limits will have an impact on some distributors. And so we are keen to hear your views on the proposal that we've made in that space. So please, if you do have views on the reliance limits, please put those into your submissions, and we'll take those into account.
We have a similar related question from James. How and why has the Electricity Authority determined that distributors' reliance is currently too high, rather than being either too low or about right?
Yeah, so maybe one of the useful concepts in there, again in the expert report, there's discussion about how changes in reliance limits cause subsidies. So over a very long period of time, over decades, you can establish an efficient equilibrium with relatively low connection charges and high ongoing charges, or vice versa. If you go from a world where you've got low upfront charges to higher upfront charges, unless you're ring fencing those new customers and giving them lower ongoing charges, you're going to be shifting costs to those newcomers compared to the people already on the network. So it's not just about the level, but it's about the change in the level and how that's managed over time.
Thank you, Ross. We have a question next from Robert, directed towards Catherine and Ross again. Why has the authority used the concept of incremental cost rather than avoidable cost?
They're very related concepts, and I think the in this case, when you're thinking about a connection and some costs that are being incurred to establish the connection, it's a more intuitive term than avoidable costs, which gets used in the pricing principles more in the ongoing tariff kind of context, where you can think about the long-term avoidable costs of serving a class of consumer. So I wouldn't read too much into the difference. Very similar concepts.
Thank you. We have a question from earlier from Ruben. It's a bit lengthy, bear with me. So what steps will be taken to ensure that the reforms support not only large-scale supply projects, but also on the residential scale, i.e. demand side, small businesses and households looking to electrify? How will the new regulations account for regional differences in electricity demand and infrastructure capabilities to ensure equitable access to network connections across the country? Alan, did you want to take a first crack at this?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So we haven't really turned our mind, to be honest, to small-scale load applications. It's never really come up as a major issue. It's more the large guys that have told us they have challenges getting connected, and the variations and the processes and the different application templates and all that sort of stuff. And we aren't hearing the same noise about small-scale load applications. And so we haven't really turned our mind to it. But, you know, it's certainly something to think about. We haven't asked for views on various things in my paper because I think it's long enough, you know, including what might be in stage 2, the network connections process. But we will go through a process of determining which are the issues that people want us to focus on. And that will include consideration of smaller load applications.
Thank you, Alan. We have a question from Alan. Alan Ives. Growth CapEx related to the reliance limits. Growth CapEx is a factor of growth or expected growth within a region. How does the average 48% base provide a suitable benchmark for all distributors? Catherine?
Yeah, again, it goes back to that rate of change thing. So the you know, what reliance level you might end up with as a distributor, if you're sitting at the neutral point or the balance point, will vary by distributor because it's a function of a lot of things, including the mix of connection projects that you have, the types of connection projects, rural versus urban, large versus small, and how you're allocating revenue and what your growth pressures look like. So it's not the case that there's a reliance level that is corresponds to one of those points, neutral, balanced, bypass point, and that's sufficient for everyone. So it's really it's a safeguard to prevent worsening of reliance levels.
Thanks, Tim. We have, thanks, Ross. Sorry. We don't have any additional questions coming through, but we do have time for one more, if anyone is a fast typer. In that case, I'll hand it back over to Tim to potentially close us out.
Well, thank you all very much for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and also the time you've taken to read through the papers. Just to reiterate, we are really looking forward to your submissions. We'll be taking those into account and reading them very carefully. We really appreciate your input. It helps us to make a better regulation. So thanks again for your time.